Maybe now you'll finally learn your place," my daughter-in-law whispered in my ear at my son's wedding, just before warm mashed potatoes slid across the front of my silk dress, and the entire ballroom went silent. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply stood there with butter on my pearls and gravy dripping slowly onto the marble floor, while 200 guests pretended not to stare. My son Daniel froze beside the champagne tower, his face pale beneath the soft golden lights of the ballroom. For one long second, I truly believed he would walk toward me, put his arm around my shoulders, and say the words any decent son would say to his mother. But he didn't move. He just looked down at the floor, as if avoiding eye contact could somehow erase what had just happened. Vanessa smiled politely at the nearby guests and adjusted the lace sleeve of her designer wedding gown like nothing unusual had occurred. "The catering area is through those doors," she said softly, nodding toward the kitchen entrance behind me. "Someone should probably help clean you up." A few people shifted awkwardly in their seats. I heard silverware clink against china somewhere near the dance floor. An older woman near the window covered her mouth in disbelief. The wedding band stopped playing mid-song. I could still smell rosemary chicken, melted butter, and fresh dinner rolls hanging heavily in the air. My late husband used to say that humiliation had a temperature. Standing there at 68 years old with mashed potatoes cooling against my skin, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Earlier that morning, I had woken up at 4:30 before sunrise in my little brick house outside Chicago. I curled my silver hair carefully, pinned on the pearl earrings Robert bought me on our 30th anniversary, and wrapped Vanessa's wedding gift in soft ivory paper. It was a family heirloom, a diamond brooch passed through 4 generations of Harper women. I remembered holding it in my hands while sitting at my kitchen table, thinking maybe this wedding would finally make me feel like part of their lives again. Maybe after years of distance and awkward holiday dinners, Daniel would look at me the way he used to before law school, before country clubs and luxury condos, and Vanessa Blake. My son wasn't always this way. There was a time when Daniel would sit on a stool inside my diner after school doing homework while I refilled coffee cups for truck drivers and factory workers. I worked 14-hour shifts for nearly 3 decades to give him the kind of life I never had. I sold my wedding ring to help pay his first semester at Northwestern Law. I skipped vacations, ignored my arthritis, and kept smiling through double shifts because every exhausted night felt worth it when I looked at my son. And now I stood in a ballroom worth more than my entire neighborhood, watching him avoid my eyes while his bride quietly erased me from the picture-perfect wedding she had spent a year building. The ballroom itself looked like something out of a magazine. Crystal chandeliers reflected against towering floral arrangements filled with white roses and orchids. Gold-trimmed plates covered every table. Waiters in pressed black jackets moved silently between guests carrying trays of filet mignon and wine that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Vanessa loved appearances. She loved curated perfection, polished photographs, and people with old money last names. There was no room in that world for a woman who spent 35 years serving meatloaf specials inside a family diner beside Interstate 90. I think I understood that the moment I saw my assigned seat earlier that evening. Table 22. Right beside the kitchen doors. Not with family. Not beside Daniel. Not even near the wedding party. Every time those swinging kitchen doors opened, heat and noise rushed over me while guests at the center tables laughed beneath candlelight. Even then, I told myself not to overthink it. I told myself weddings were stressful. I told myself Vanessa didn't really mean to hurt me. But then came the mashed potatoes. Then came her hand pressing hard against my shoulder while she smiled for the guests. Then came my son lowering his eyes instead of defending the woman who gave him everything. And standing there in that cold, silent ballroom, I realized something far worse than embarrassment. I realized I had not been invited there as family. I had been invited there to be reminded of my place. Nobody followed me when I walked out of the ballroom except a young waitress carrying a stack of folded linen napkins against her chest. She looked barely 20 years old, nervous and pale beneath the bright hallway lights. "Ma'am," she whispered carefully as I stood near the restroom mirrors trying to wipe gravy from my necklace with damp paper towels. "I am so sorry." I looked at her reflection beside mine. She had tears in her eyes like she was somehow embarrassed for an entire room full of strangers. I gave her a small smile and thanked her, but my hands would not stop trembling. The mashed potatoes had cooled by then, stiff against the navy silk fabric of my dress. Robert bought that dress for me 6 years before cancer took him. We wore matching blue to our last anniversary dinner at a small steakhouse near Lake Geneva. I remembered how proud he looked introducing me to the waiter as his wife. 38 years together, and he still reached for my hand every time we crossed a parking lot. I missed him most during moments like this, moments when the world suddenly felt cold and unfamiliar. The waitress handed me a warm towel from the kitchen and quietly said, "Some of the guests are talking about what happened." I nodded slowly because of course they were. Weddings survive on gossip almost as much as champagne. Somewhere beyond those heavy ballroom doors, people were lowering their voices and pretending not to stare while replaying the scene in their minds. The mother of the groom standing frozen beneath crystal chandeliers while the bride smiled like nothing had happened. I dabbed carefully at my pearls. One of them had come loose from the necklace clasp and disappeared somewhere inside the ballroom. Strange how grief works at my age. You stop mourning the expensive things first. I did not care about the ruined dress. I did not care about the whispers. But losing one tiny pearl from the necklace Robert gave me felt unbearable. I stayed in that restroom nearly 20 minutes listening to muffled laughter and distant music bleed through the walls. At some point, the wedding band started playing again. Life always resumes quickly for people who are not humiliated. When I finally stepped back into the hallway, I saw Daniel standing alone near the entrance to the terrace with his hands in his pockets. The moment he noticed me approaching, his shoulders stiffened. For a second, I saw the little boy he used to be. The child who cried after scraping his knee at the park. The teenager who once saved allowance money for 3 months just to buy me perfume for Mother's Day. But adulthood changes some people quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you no longer recognize the person standing in front of you. "Mom," he said softly, glancing toward the ballroom doors to make sure nobody was close enough to hear us. Vanessa did not mean for things to go that far. I stared at him in silence. Those words hurt more than anything that happened inside that ballroom. Not because of what he said, but because he had already chosen her version of events over his own eyes. "Go that far," I repeated quietly. "Daniel, she treated me like I was less than human." He rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "She is stressed. The wedding has been a lot." I almost laughed at that. Stress. Such a clean little word people use to excuse cruelty. I looked past him through the ballroom windows where guests lifted champagne glasses beneath glowing chandeliers, while Vanessa posed for photographs at the center of it all. Beautiful, elegant, untouchable. "Do you know where she seated me tonight?" I asked him. Daniel looked away immediately, which told me he already knew. "Mom, it was just logistics." "No," I said calmly. "It was intentional." The cold evening air drifted through the open terrace doors carrying the scent of lake water and cigarette smoke from somewhere below the hotel gardens. Daniel looked exhausted suddenly, older than 37. "Can we please not do this tonight?" he asked. That sentence settled heavily inside my chest because I finally understood something I should have accepted years ago. My son did not want truth. He wanted comfort. He wanted peace at any cost, even if the cost was his mother's dignity. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small velvet box containing Vanessa's wedding gift. The diamond brooch caught the terrace lights as I held it between us. "I was going to give her this before the first dance," I said quietly. Daniel stared at the family heirloom with surprise. "Mom." I closed the box gently and slipped it back into my purse. "Do not worry," I told him softly. "She made herself very clear tonight." Then I walked past my son and toward the elevator while the music from the ballroom echoed behind me like noise from a world I no longer belonged to. The elevator ride down to the hotel lobby felt longer than it probably was. I stood alone beneath the soft yellow lighting while quiet piano music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. Someone had placed fresh lilies near the reception desk, and their sweet perfume mixed strangely with the faint smell of butter still clinging to my dress. Every mirrored surface reflected a version of me I barely recognized. My silver hair had started to fall loose around my face, and there was still a pale stain across the front of my navy dress, no matter how carefully I had cleaned it in the restroom upstairs. The young valet near the entrance glanced at me once, then quickly looked away out of politeness. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. Outside, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath the cold spring night. Blacktown cars lined the curb while guests laughed beneath the glowing awning of the Grand Marquette Hotel. I could hear distant music each time the ballroom doors opened upstairs. Life continued so easily for everyone else. I tightened my coat around my shoulders and waited for the hotel attendant to bring my car. "Mrs. Harper?" a calm voice said behind me. I turned slowly and saw an older woman standing near the fireplace lounge beside the lobby bar. She wore a black evening gown with a long silver necklace resting against her chest, and her posture carried the kind of quiet confidence money cannot buy overnight. I recognized her almost immediately, though I had only seen her face in newspapers and local business magazines over the years. Margaret Sullivan, owner of Sullivan Hospitality Group, one of the wealthiest women in Illinois. "I hope you do not mind me stopping you," she said gently. "I just wanted to say that what happened upstairs was unacceptable." I felt embarrassment rise inside me all over again. Somehow hearing the words spoken out loud made the humiliation more real. "Thank you," I replied quietly. "Weddings can be emotional." Margaret looked at me for a long moment with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. "No," she said calmly. "Cruelty is not emotion. It is character." Her words settled heavily in the silence between us. Somewhere behind the bar, glasses clinked softly while a television above the shelves played muted sports highlights. The ordinary sounds of the world felt strangely disconnected from the ache inside my chest. Margaret gestured toward the empty chairs near the fireplace. "Would you sit with me for a minute?" she asked. I hesitated only briefly before nodding. The leather chair felt soft beneath me after hours spent sitting stiffly in ballroom seating that never truly belonged to me. A server approached, and Margaret ordered chamomile tea for both of us without even glancing at the menu. "You probably do not remember me," she said once the server walked away. "But 20 years ago, when my husband was dying at Northwestern Memorial, your diner was the only place open after midnight near the hospital." I blinked in surprise. "Harper's Diner?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Every single night for 6 months. You used to keep the coffee fresh for the overnight nurses and let exhausted families sit for hours without rushing them." Memories slowly returned. A tired woman in expensive coats sitting quietly at the corner booth near the pie display. Always polite. Always alone. One night, Margaret continued softly, I realized I forgot my wallet after eating dinner. I was mortified, but you simply told me to take care of my husband and pay another time. I remembered then. Barely. There had been so many people over the years carrying grief into my diner at 2 in the morning. "You came back the next day?" I said quietly. Margaret nodded. "And I never forgot your kindness." The server placed steaming teacups in front of us. The warmth against my hands steadied me slightly. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Margaret leaned back slowly in her chair. "I also heard your daughter-in-law speaking to some guests before the reception," she said carefully. My stomach tightened immediately. "What do you mean?" Margaret's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. "She referred to you as the diner woman. She said she spent months trying to make sure the wedding looked refined despite your background." I stared down at the tea trembling slightly inside the porcelain cup. Somehow those words hurt worse than the ballroom incident itself, because they explained everything. The seating arrangement, the avoidance, the coldness hidden beneath forced smiles. Vanessa had not been embarrassed by me because of something I did tonight. She had been embarrassed by me from the beginning. "I am sorry," Margaret said quietly. "You deserved better from your own family." Family. The word barely felt real anymore. Upstairs, my son was probably dancing beneath crystal chandeliers with the woman who publicly humiliated his mother while guests applauded around them. I wrapped both hands around the teacup and stared into the steam rising softly between us. "You know the strange thing?" I whispered after a long silence. "I still spent the whole evening worrying whether I embarrassed them." Margaret's face softened then, and for the first time that night, someone looked at me with something that felt dangerously close to respect. I did not return home immediately after leaving the hotel. Instead, I drove slowly through downtown Chicago with the windows cracked just enough to let the cold night air clear my thoughts. The city looked beautiful after midnight. Streetlights reflected against the river like ribbons of gold, and people filled the sidewalks outside restaurants and jazz bars completely unaware that somewhere across town a 68-year-old woman was trying to understand how her own child had become a stranger. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the clock on the dashboard read 12:43 a.m. My little brick house sat quietly beneath the porch light exactly as Robert left it. Simple, warm, honest. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, immediately greeted by the faint scent of cinnamon and coffee that always lingered in the kitchen no matter how often I cleaned. For the first time all evening, I could finally breathe without feeling watched. I hung my coat carefully near the doorway and stood silently in the dark living room. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked softly through the stillness. Robert bought that clock from an antique store in Milwaukee nearly 20 years ago after insisting our home needed something dignified. I smiled sadly, remembering the way he used to tease me for filling every room with diner menus, recipe cards, and family photographs. "You run this house like one of your booths," he would joke. "Everybody leaves full and emotionally overfed." I walked slowly toward the hallway mirror and finally looked at myself properly beneath the soft lamplight. There was still a faint stain near the collar of my dress despite all my cleaning at the hotel. My makeup had worn away hours ago, leaving my face tired and older than usual. But it was my eyes that unsettled me most. They looked different somehow. Not broken, just awake. I carefully removed the pearl necklace and placed it inside the velvet jewelry box on my bedroom dresser. One pearl missing. 30 years ago, that missing pearl would have sent me into tears. Tonight, I simply stared at the empty space and thought about all the things women quietly lose over a lifetime while pretending not to notice. Sleep never came that night. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table wrapped in Robert's old gray cardigan while memories drifted through my mind one after another like scenes from somebody else's life. Daniel at 8 years old proudly handing me a handmade Mother's Day card covered in crooked red hearts. Daniel at 16 begging me to stay open late at the diner so his baseball team could celebrate after winning regionals. Daniel at 22 crying in my arms after his first serious heartbreak. Somewhere between those memories and tonight's ballroom silence, my son had slowly disappeared. Or maybe the truth was harder than that. Maybe he had simply learned that life became easier when he stopped defending me. I poured myself a cup of coffee, even though dawn was still hours away. The kitchen window overlooked the empty parking lot beside Harper's Diner across the street. My diner. My life's work. The faded neon sign still glowed red and blue through the darkness, just like it had every night since 1987. I remembered standing inside that empty building with Robert before opening day, while paint fumes filled the air and our savings account sat nearly empty. We built that diner from nothing. We survived recessions, brutal winters, equipment failures, and 16-hour workdays fueled entirely by cheap coffee and stubbornness. There were nights I slept in a booth because we could not afford enough staff. I missed anniversaries. I missed holidays. I developed arthritis in both hands from years of lifting cast iron skillets and industrial coffee pots. But I never complained because every sacrifice had a purpose. Daniel would never struggle the way we did. Daniel would have opportunities. Education. Stability. Respect. I looked across the dark parking lot again and suddenly remembered something Vanessa once said during Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier. She had laughed lightly while studying the diner through my kitchen window and said, "I still cannot believe people romanticize places like that." At the time, Daniel chuckled awkwardly and changed the subject while I pretended not to care. Tonight, sitting alone beneath the hum of my kitchen lights, I finally understood that Vanessa had been telling me exactly who she was from the beginning. I had simply spent years choosing politeness over honesty. Around 3:30 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated softly against the table. Daniel's name appeared across the screen. I stared at it for a long moment before letting the call go unanswered. Seconds later, a message appeared. "Mom, please call me tomorrow. Vanessa feels terrible." I read those words twice. Not, "I am sorry." Not, "Are you okay?" Only, "Vanessa feels terrible." I set the phone face down beside my coffee cup and looked toward the diner one more time as the first traces of dawn slowly began turning the Chicago sky pale blue. The diner opened at 6 every morning except Sundays, and by 5:30 I was already behind the counter tying on my apron while the coffee machines hummed softly in the background. Habit survives heartbreak better than almost anything else. The booths still needed wiping. The syrup dispensers still needed refilling. Truck drivers still wanted eggs over easy with rye toast and black coffee strong enough to wake the dead. For 35 years, Harper's Diner had operated like clockwork, and I refused to let one terrible wedding night change that. Outside, rain drizzled steadily over Chicago, turning the parking lot silver beneath the weak morning light. Inside, the familiar smell of bacon grease, coffee, and fresh biscuits wrapped around me like an old blanket. "Morning, Miss Evelyn," Louise called from the kitchen as he rolled trays of cinnamon rolls onto the counter. "You okay? You left the wedding early last night." I forced a small smile while arranging menus beside the register. "Just tired." He studied my face for a second too long, but thankfully said nothing else. I appreciated people who understood silence. By 7 o'clock, the diner had filled with regulars escaping the cold rain outside. Construction workers in neon jackets. Retired couples sharing pancakes. Nurses from the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. Ordinary people with tired eyes and decent hearts. The kind of people Vanessa spent her entire life looking down on. Around 8:15, the front bell above the diner door chimed softly, and every conversation near the counter seemed to quiet at once. Margaret Sullivan stepped inside wearing a cream-colored wool coat and dark sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. She looked strangely out of place against the cracked tile floors and spinning pie display, yet somehow perfectly comfortable at the same time. "Well," she said quietly as she removed her gloves, glancing around the diner with a faint smile, "it still smells exactly the same." I could not help smiling back slightly. That is either a compliment or a health code violation. Margaret laughed softly and slid into the corner booth near the front window. The same booth she used to sit in 20 years ago during those long hospital nights with her husband. I poured her coffee without asking because some routines deserve respect. "I almost did not come," she admitted after taking her first sip. "But I kept thinking about you sitting here alone after last night." I shrugged lightly. There are worse things than being alone. Her sharp gray eyes studied me carefully over the rim of her coffee cup. "Yes," she said quietly. "There are." Rain tapped steadily against the windows while customers moved around us in slow morning rhythms. Somewhere behind me, a little boy laughed over a stack of chocolate chip pancakes while his exhausted mother drank coffee like survival depended on it. The ordinary warmth of the diner made the ballroom from last night feel almost unreal now, like something cruel I dreamed beneath bad lighting. Margaret reached into her leather handbag and carefully placed a folded business newspaper on the table between us. "You should probably see this," she said. I looked down at the front page business section and immediately recognized Daniel's photograph beside a headline about legal expansion and commercial real estate investments. My chest tightened slightly. "His firm has been struggling quietly for over a year," Margaret explained. "Most people do not know it yet." I looked up at her in surprise. "Daniel never said anything." "Because appearances matter to people like Vanessa," she replied calmly. "And because your son is trying very hard to maintain a lifestyle that costs more than he can actually afford." I stared down at the article again while rain streaked softly across the diner windows beside us. Suddenly memories started connecting themselves in uncomfortable ways. Daniel casually asking whether I had considered selling the diner property. Vanessa insisting I should finally retire comfortably. The awkward conversations about investments and family planning. None of it had been random. Margaret stirred cream into her coffee slowly before continuing. "Do you know how much that wedding probably cost?" I shook my head faintly. $300,000 at least. Maybe more. I nearly laughed from disbelief. $300,000. Robert and I built this entire diner for less than 1/3 of that amount in 1987. Margaret leaned forward slightly, then lowered her voice. "Evelyn, I overheard Vanessa speaking with a guest last night before the reception. She said once you sold the diner property, Daniel's financial problems would disappear overnight." The diner suddenly felt colder despite the warmth from the kitchen grills behind me. I looked around slowly at the booths, the coffee-stained menus, the old photographs hanging along the walls. Every inch of this place carried pieces of my life inside it. Robert painting the ceiling himself after closing hours. Daniel doing homework in booth 7 while snowstorms buried the city outside. Generations of customers celebrating birthdays, engagements, promotions, and recoveries over pie and coffee. And somewhere beneath all of Vanessa's polished smiles and elegant manners had been one simple expectation: that eventually this place would become theirs too. Margaret watched my expression carefully. "I thought you deserved to know the truth," she said softly. I folded the newspaper slowly and stared out at the rain falling across the parking lot, while something inside me settled into place with surprising calm. For the first time since the wedding, I no longer felt confused. Hurt, yes, but not confused. For the next 3 days, I said nothing to Daniel. I ignored his calls, his polite messages, and the carefully worded voicemail he left late Monday night asking if we could clear up the misunderstanding. That phrase almost made me smile. There are some things in life that cannot be misunderstood. A person either protects your dignity or they do not. Meanwhile, Harper's Diner continued moving through its ordinary routines with the comforting predictability of an old song. Coffee poured. Plates clattered. Rain eventually gave way to cold sunshine over Chicago. And somewhere beneath the rhythm of everyday life, I quietly started paying attention to details I had ignored for far too long. Tuesday afternoon, I sat alone in my office above the diner balancing invoices when I noticed a stack of unopened envelopes tucked beside the filing cabinet. Most were advertisements and utility notices, but one envelope carried the logo of a commercial real estate firm downtown. My stomach tightened slightly the moment I saw Daniel's law office address printed beneath the return label. I opened it slowly. Inside was a notice regarding a temporary loan extension tied to a refinancing agreement. Several sentences had been highlighted in yellow marker by someone at the bank. Balloon payment due within 90 days. Failure to secure additional collateral may result in immediate restructuring. I stared at the paper for a long time while traffic moved slowly outside my office window below. Daniel had used my diner property as collateral. Not directly, of course. He would never have been foolish enough to forge documents. But suddenly I remembered a meeting from 8 months earlier when Daniel arrived carrying coffee and pastries, speaking gently about estate planning and protecting family assets. I remembered signing several papers while trusting my son completely. My chest felt strangely calm as realization settled into place. They never planned to ask for the diner. They planned to corner me into giving it away. There is a particular kind of grief that comes when betrayal finally begins making sense. It is quieter than heartbreak. Colder. More organized. That evening after closing, I drove downtown to meet Margaret at a private restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan. The dining room glowed softly beneath amber lighting while businessmen in expensive suits spoke quietly over wine and steak dinners. Margaret listened carefully without interrupting as I handed her copies of the loan documents. I suspected something like this, she admitted after reading the pages slowly. Daniel's firm expanded too aggressively after the pandemic. They leased luxury office space they could not comfortably afford. I wrapped both hands around my teacup, staring out at the dark water beyond the windows. He used to hate debt, I said quietly. Robert taught him never to borrow more than you could survive losing. Margaret folded the papers neatly before placing them back inside the envelope. Vanessa likes appearances, she said simply. People who build their identity around appearances eventually become desperate to maintain them. I thought about the ballroom again. The chandeliers, the designer wedding gown, the imported flowers. $300,000 spent creating one perfect evening while they quietly waited for me to hand over the only real thing our family ever built. There is more, Margaret said carefully after a long silence. I almost did not tell you because I was not certain you should hear it. Something in her expression made my stomach tighten immediately. What is it? Margaret hesitated briefly before speaking. 2 weeks before the wedding, Vanessa approached one of my business associates asking whether Harper's Diner would be more valuable after redevelopment. I blinked slowly. Redevelopment. Luxury condominiums, Margaret replied quietly. Apparently the location is desirable now that the neighborhood is improving. The restaurant suddenly felt too warm around me. Harper's Diner reduced to demolition plans and property value estimates. 35 years of memories flattened into investment opportunities and rooftop parking. I looked down at my hands resting against the white tablecloth. The same hands that once worked 16 hours a day flipping pancakes and carrying coffee pots while Daniel slept upstairs in the diner office because I could not afford babysitters. She already planned my replacement before the wedding even happened, I whispered. Margaret did not disagree. Outside the restaurant windows, city lights reflected across Lake Michigan like scattered pieces of glass. I sat very still while something inside me shifted quietly into certainty. Vanessa believed kindness made people weak. Daniel believed avoiding conflict would somehow protect him from consequences. Neither of them understood the difference between a woman who is broken and a woman who is simply done being underestimated. Margaret reached across the table then and gently touched my hand. Evelyn, she said softly, what are you going to do? I looked out toward the dark Chicago skyline for a long moment before answering. The same thing I have done my entire life, I said calmly. I am going to protect what belongs to me. The following Friday, I invited Daniel and Vanessa to dinner. Not because I had forgiven them, and certainly not because I wanted explanations. Some truths no longer need clarification once you finally see them clearly. I invited them because after 70 years of life, I had learned something important about people. When individuals believe they are winning, they stop hiding who they really are. All afternoon, I cooked quietly inside my kitchen while soft jazz played from the old radio near the refrigerator. The rain had finally disappeared, leaving Chicago wrapped in one of those cool spring evenings where the air smells faintly of wet pavement and blooming trees. I peeled potatoes slowly at the sink while sunlight faded across the diner parking lot outside my window. Mashed potatoes had always been Daniel's favorite comfort food growing up. When he was little, he used to insist on extra butter and enough gravy to make the plate look like a lake. Back then, his laughter filled every corner of this house. Strange how memory can make grief feel almost warm. By 6 o'clock, the dining table was set with my best dishes. White candles flickered softly beside folded linen napkins. Pot roast rested beneath silver serving covers, while fresh rolls cooled in a basket near the stove. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary, respectable, the way family dinners are supposed to feel. At exactly 6:30, headlights swept across the front windows. I watched through the curtains as Daniel climbed out of his black Mercedes while Vanessa adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored coat before checking her reflection in the passenger mirror. Even after everything, appearances remained important to her. Daniel knocked gently before opening the door with the spare key he still carried. "Mom," he called carefully into the hallway like a man stepping into unfamiliar territory. "In the dining room," I answered calmly. They entered together wearing the cautious expressions people use before funerals and courtroom verdicts. Vanessa carried a small white bakery box tied with ribbon. "We brought dessert," she said softly, avoiding direct eye contact as she placed it on the counter. "That was thoughtful," I replied. For a moment, silence settled heavily between us while the candles flickered quietly against the polished table. Daniel loosened his tie and cleared his throat. "The house smells good. Thank you." We sat down together like actors performing a scene none of us fully believed anymore. I served dinner carefully while Vanessa complimented the roast and Daniel asked polite questions about the diner. The entire conversation felt thin and fragile, balanced awkwardly above everything left unsaid. Finally, halfway through dinner, Vanessa placed her fork down gently against her plate. "Evelyn," she began softly, "I know things became emotional at the wedding." Emotional. There was that word again. Clean. Convenient. Bloodless. I continued spooning mashed potatoes onto my plate without looking up. "Did they?" I asked calmly. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Daniel immediately stepped in like he always did. "Mom, nobody intended for you to feel disrespected." I looked at my son then, really looked at him. His expensive watch. His tired eyes. The faint stress lines around his mouth that had deepened over the past year. He looked exhausted in the way people do when their lives are built on maintaining illusions. "Daniel," I said quietly, "your wife pushed me toward a serving tray in front of 200 people." Vanessa inhaled sharply. "I barely touched you." I nodded slowly. That is the interesting thing about humiliation. Sometimes it only takes one small push. Silence returned to the table. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees while headlights occasionally passed beyond the dining room curtains. Finally, Vanessa folded her hands together carefully. "We came because we want to move forward as a family." There it was. Not apology. Not accountability. Strategy. I reached for the serving bowl sitting at the center of the table and calmly spooned another portion of mashed potatoes onto Vanessa's plate. Thick. Smooth. Perfectly seasoned. The steam curled gently beneath the candlelight. Vanessa looked down at the potatoes, then back at me with visible uncertainty. "You know," I said softly, "Robert always believed you could learn a great deal about people from how they treated food. Hungry people respect it. Entitled people waste it." Daniel shifted uneasily beside her. "Mom." I ignored him and reached calmly toward the folder resting beside my chair. I placed it carefully on the table between the candles and wine glasses. Vanessa's confident expression faltered the moment she saw the legal letterhead across the front page. Daniel stared at the documents for several seconds before his face slowly lost all color. The room became so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. "I met with my attorney yesterday morning," I said calmly, "and I think it is finally time we discuss what exactly belongs to this family." Daniel picked up the top page with trembling hands while Vanessa leaned closer beside him, trying to read over his shoulder. Neither of them touched their food anymore. The mashed potatoes slowly cooled beneath the candlelight between us, untouched and forgotten. I sat quietly at the head of the table, watching their expressions shift line by line across the legal documents. Confusion first, then disbelief, then fear. "Mom," Daniel whispered finally, staring down at the papers. "What is this?" I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "It is a transfer agreement." Vanessa's eyes snapped toward me immediately. "Transfer," she repeated sharply. "What does that mean?" I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. "It means Harper's Diner was sold yesterday morning." Silence swallowed the room completely. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly seemed louder. Daniel blinked several times like his mind could not process the words fast enough. "Sold," he said again. "You sold the diner?" I nodded once, along with the property beneath it. Vanessa straightened in her chair, so quickly the legs scraped softly against the hardwood floor. "You cannot be serious." "Actually," I replied calmly, "the contracts are fully finalized." Daniel looked pale now, genuinely shaken in a way I had never seen before. "Mom, why would you do that without talking to me first?" The question almost made me laugh. After everything, my son still believed he deserved consultation about decisions involving my life's work. "That is interesting," I said quietly, "because nobody consulted me when my diner was being discussed as future condominium property." The color drained from Vanessa's face instantly. Daniel turned toward her with confusion. "What is she talking about?" Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. That silence told me more than any confession ever could. I reached for my water glass slowly. "Margaret Sullivan informed me about the redevelopment conversations taking place before your wedding." Daniel stared at his wife in disbelief. "Vanessa?" She recovered quickly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her sleeve the way she always did when nervous. "It was just preliminary discussion," she said tightly. "Everyone explores investment opportunities." "Using my diner?" I asked softly. "Without my knowledge." Daniel looked back down at the papers in front of him while tension settled heavily across his face. "Mom," he said carefully, "the diner has sentimental value, but financially it probably made sense to modernize the property eventually." There it was. Not grief over losing family history. Not concern for me. Financial logic. Return on investment. The language of people who no longer see memories as sacred once money enters the room. I studied my son quietly across the candlelight and suddenly understood something painful. Daniel did love me once. I truly believe that. But somewhere along the way, ambition taught him to measure worth differently. Efficiency instead of loyalty. Appearances instead of gratitude. Vanessa simply encouraged what was already growing inside him. "Do you know what your father used to say about this diner?" I asked quietly. Daniel avoided my eyes. "He said it fed more than stomachs." My voice remained calm despite the ache building slowly beneath every word. "Your father believed people deserved one place in life where they felt welcome no matter how tired, broke, lonely, or forgotten they were." Vanessa folded her arms defensively. "Nobody is attacking your memories, Evelyn." "No," I replied softly. "You only plan to bulldoze them." The room fell silent again. Outside, wind moved through the trees beyond the dining room windows while headlights drifted occasionally across the curtains from passing cars. Ordinary life continuing while my family quietly unraveled around the dinner table. Daniel looked down at the final page of the contract again. "Sullivan Hospitality Group," he said slowly. "Margaret Sullivan bought the diner?" I nodded once. "She made a very generous offer." Vanessa's expression darkened immediately. "Of course she did," she muttered bitterly. "That woman practically worships you." I smiled faintly at that because admiration was something Vanessa could never understand unless it benefited her socially. "Margaret also agreed to preserve the diner exactly as it is," I continued calmly. "No demolition, no redevelopment, no luxury condominiums." Daniel closed his eyes briefly and leaned back in his chair like the weight of everything was finally settling onto him all at once. "You knew we were struggling financially," he said quietly. "You could have helped us." I looked at my son for a very long moment before answering. "I spent 37 years helping you." My voice remained soft, but something inside it finally carried truth without apology. "And the first moment your wife believed I embarrassed her in front of wealthy guests, she treated me like something disposable." Vanessa's face hardened. "That is not fair." I tilted my head slightly. "No, Vanessa. Fair would have been allowing your husband's mother to sit with her family at his wedding." Nobody spoke after that. The candles flickered gently between us while untouched mashed potatoes cooled beside the legal contracts. Finally, I stood slowly from the table and gathered the serving dishes one by one. "Dinner is over," I said quietly. "And so is this conversation." 3 months later, Chicago finally began warming into summer. The trees lining my street filled with green again, flower boxes appeared outside storefronts downtown, and Harper's Diner reopened under its new partnership with Sullivan Hospitality Group, looking almost exactly the same as it always had. Margaret kept her promise. The booths remained untouched. The old neon sign still flickered red and blue above the parking lot each night. Even the pie display case stayed in the exact same spot near the register because, according to Margaret, some things become landmarks long before people realize it. The only real difference was me. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, I no longer worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Margaret insisted on hiring additional staff and renovating the upstairs office into a small culinary scholarship center for women over 50 who wanted to restart their lives after divorce, widowhood, or financial hardship. Every Tuesday afternoon, I taught free cooking classes in the diner kitchen to women who reminded me of younger versions of myself. Tired women, strong women, women who had spent decades feeding everyone else while quietly forgetting their own worth. Somehow, helping them healed parts of me I did not even realize were broken. Daniel called many times during those first few weeks after our dinner conversation. At first, his messages sounded defensive, then frustrated, eventually exhausted. I listened to every voicemail only once before deleting them quietly. There are moments in life when silence becomes the final honest answer. I heard through mutual friends that his law firm downsized shortly after losing a major commercial account. Apparently, several investors became nervous after learning about the company's financial instability. Margaret never confirmed whether she influenced those decisions directly, and I never asked. Some things are better left understood without discussion. Wealthy communities pretend to value status above all else, but what they actually worship is discretion. Public cruelty embarrasses everyone eventually. One afternoon in June, nearly 4 months after the wedding, Daniel appeared unexpectedly at the diner just before closing time. The dinner rush had ended, and sunlight streamed softly through the front windows while waitresses wiped down empty booths. I looked up from the register and almost did not recognize my son at first. He looked thinner somehow, older. The expensive confidence he once carried so naturally had faded into something quieter and uncertain. "Hi, Mom," he said carefully as he approached the counter. I nodded politely. "Coffee?" He gave a faint smile. "Please." I poured him a cup without another word and placed it in front of him exactly the way I had thousands of times throughout his life. 2 creamers. No sugar. The diner hummed softly around us beneath the fading golden light of evening. Finally, Daniel looked up at me with tired eyes. "Vanessa moved out last month," he said quietly. I felt no triumph hearing those words. Only sadness. Sadness for the little boy who once believed family meant safety. Sadness for the man who spent too long confusing appearances with happiness. "I am sorry," I said honestly. Daniel swallowed hard and stared down at his coffee. "I should have defended you." The words hung gently between us. Simple, late, real. I leaned against the counter and studied my son carefully. "Yes," I replied softly. He nodded once like someone accepting a truth he could no longer argue with. Outside, evening traffic moved steadily past the diner windows while neon signs slowly flickered awake across the street. Daniel looked around the diner, then at the familiar booths, the old menu boards, the pie case glowing softly near the entrance. "Dad would have hated what I became," he whispered. That sentence hurt more than anything else because I knew how long it must have taken him to say it out loud. I reached across the counter and gently covered his hand with mine. Older hands. Softer now. Still steady. Your father believed people can lose themselves, I said quietly. But he also believed decent people find their way back if they are willing to face the truth. Daniel lowered his eyes and nodded silently. For the first time in a very long while, I saw genuine shame instead of excuses. Real regret instead of polished explanations. It did not erase what happened. Some wounds never fully disappear. But forgiveness, I have learned, is not about pretending pain never existed. It is about refusing to let humiliation become the final chapter of your life. As the last customers drifted out into the warm Chicago evening, I looked around the diner one more time. The same cracked tile floors. The same smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls. The same old neon sign glowing faithfully through the front windows. Vanessa once tried to make me feel small because of this place. But standing there beside everything Robert and I built together, I finally understood something she never would. There is nothing embarrassing about a life spent feeding people with love.